The house buzzed with energy, laughter bouncing off the walls. The smell of catered appetizers wafted through the air as guests mingled, glasses of wine and champagne in hand. Anthony moved through the crowd with ease, greeting friends and relatives, offering smiles and handshakes. He wore his best suit, a subtle navy that brought out the depth of his blue eyes, eyes that gleamed with pride. 15 years of marriage was no small feat, and tonight, everything felt perfect. Sandra stood a few feet away, surrounded by a group of women who were admiring the necklace Anthony had given her earlier that evening, a delicate piece with a small diamond pendant. She laughed lightly at their compliments, her fingers brushing against the jewel every now and then, as if to remind herself it was real. Her dark hair, pulled back in a graceful updo, framed her face perfectly. From the outside, they were the perfect couple, happy, successful, still deeply in love after all these years. But Anthony didn't notice the small flickers of discomfort in Sandra's eyes. He didn't see how, every few minutes, her gaze would drift across the room toward Jose, his best friend, who was already on his second glass of whiskey. Jose leaned against the kitchen counter, a drink in hand, laughing loudly at some joke one of the guests had told. He was the life of the party, as always, the kind of guy who could light up a room with his charm and easygoing attitude. But tonight, there was a slight edge to his behavior, a little more recklessness than usual. His eyes were bloodshot, and the way he threw back his whiskey hinted that this wouldn't be his last glass. "Hey, Anthony, over here," one of his colleagues called, raising a glass from across the room. Anthony waved back, grinning, his mind far from the storm brewing just a few feet away. As the night stretched on, the drinks continued to flow. Jose's laugh grew louder, his jokes cruder. He'd taken a spot on the couch now. A few people gathered around him as he shared a story about a wild weekend he'd had years ago. Sandra, standing at the kitchen island, was no longer laughing with her friends. Instead, she had grown quieter, her gaze fixed on Jose as he threw back another drink. Anthony, oblivious to the tension, called for attention as he raised his glass. Everyone, can I have your attention?" He stood at the center of the room, his arm around Sandra's waist as he pulled her closer. She stiffened slightly, but managed to smile as the room quieted down. "To my beautiful wife," Anthony began, his voice strong. 15 years ago, we made the best decision of our lives. And today, we celebrate everything we've built together, our home, our family, our incredible son, Alex." He paused, looking over at Alex, who was chatting with some of his cousins. The 15-year-old gave a small wave and then went back to his conversation. Anthony continued, "Sandra, you've been my rock, my partner, my everything. Here's to 15 more years and beyond." The room erupted in cheers, glasses raised high in the air. Anthony leaned down to kiss Sandra, who smiled weakly and kissed him back, though her eyes flickered nervously toward Jose. As the cheers died down, Jose chuckled darkly from his spot on the couch. He raised his own glass, though his hand was a little unsteady now. "To Sandra," he muttered. "Yet to Sandra." A few people nearby laughed awkwardly, sensing something off. Anthony didn't hear him clearly, but Jose wasn't done. He stood up, swaying slightly as he stumbled toward Anthony and Sandra, his face flushed. "Whoops, guess the cat's out of the bag." Jose slurred, his voice louder now. "I'm the one who knocked her up on their wedding day." The words cut through the air like a knife. The entire room froze. A glass clinked awkwardly to the floor as someone let go of their drink in shock. Anthony's smile faltered as he turned toward Jose, blinking as though he hadn't heard him correctly. "What did you say?" Anthony asked, his voice low, but edged with confusion. His arm dropped from Sandra's waist, and she instinctively stepped back, her eyes wide with panic. Jose grinned a twisted, reckless grin. "Yeah, you heard me. While you were busy with the guests, we were in the back. Your wife couldn't even wait for the honeymoon. We made sure she went home with more than just a ring." Sandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The color drained from her face as she tried to speak, but nothing came out. Anthony stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. The room felt like it had shrunk, the air thick with tension. He stared at Jose, then slowly turned his head towards Sandra, his eyes searching hers for denial, for any sign that this was some sick joke. But Sandra's silence said it all. Her trembling lips, the tears welling in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. Sandra. Anthony's voice was barely a whisper now, but there was a coldness in it that made everyone in the room flinch. Is this true? Sandra's lips quivered as the tears spilled over. She shook her head, but it was too late. Anthony, please, she begged, her voice breaking. It was a mistake. I never meant for. Anthony raised a hand, cutting her off. Stop. The word came out sharper than he intended, and Sandra flinched as though he had struck her. The room was still silent. Everyone watching the unraveling of a marriage in real time, no one daring to move. Jose, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, tried to backtrack. Hey man, I was just kidding. You know how I get when I drink, but Anthony wasn't listening anymore. His world had collapsed in a single moment, the weight of betrayal crushing him. His hand shook as he set down his glass, carefully, deliberately. He didn't look at Sandra again. He didn't say another word. Without another glance at anyone in the room, Anthony turned and walked out the front door. The sound of the door closing behind him was deafening in the silence. For a few moments, no one moved. The party had come to a sudden, brutal halt. Some of the guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do, while others shifted awkwardly, looking anywhere but at Sandra, who stood in the middle of the room, shaking with silent sobs. Jose, his drunken bravado fading, looked around the room, his face pale. He had gone too far, and he knew it. He stepped forward, as if to follow Anthony, but one of the guests grabbed his arm and shook their head. Not now, they whispered. Meanwhile, Sandra turned to Alex, who had been watching the whole scene unfold with wide, confused eyes. Mom, he said, his voice small and unsure. What's going on? Sandra wiped at her tears, but they kept falling. She couldn't answer him. What could she possibly say? She looked toward the door where Anthony had disappeared, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought about running after him, begging for forgiveness, trying to explain, but deep down, she knew it was too late. Anthony was gone, and with him, the life they had built. One of Sandra's friends stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sandra, she said softly, do you want us to stay? But Sandra shook her head, still unable to speak. She felt numb, as though the world had slipped away from her and she was floating in some dark, empty space. The guests began to leave one by one, murmuring awkward goodbyes as they shuffled out the door, leaving Sandra alone in the wreckage of her marriage. Only Alex remained, standing beside her, his face etched with confusion and fear. For what felt like hours, Sandra stood there in the empty house, staring at the door, waiting for Anthony to come back. But he never did. For too long, agonizing weeks, Anthony was gone. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of where he might be or what he was thinking. Sandra woke up every morning to the cold, empty space in their bed, and with each passing day, the weight of her guilt grew heavier. She tried to keep up a semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. Her world was unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She tried calling him over and over again. Every time she dialed his number, her heart raced, hoping he would pick up, hoping for a chance to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But each call went straight to voicemail. Anthony, please call me back. I need to talk to you, she would say in a trembling voice, leaving messages that she knew he wasn't listening to. Sandra even tried reaching out to his friends. She called Tom, one of Anthony's oldest buddies, under the guise of casual conversation, but her desperation was clear. Tom, have you heard from Anthony? I haven't seen him in days. I'm starting to worry. Tom's voice was cautious. No, Sandra. Haven't heard a thing. He's probably just taking some time. Maybe give him some space. Space. That was all anyone ever suggested, as if space could somehow repair the damage that had been done. She drove by his workplace a few times, even sat in the parking lot, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. But Anthony had made himself invisible. He had shut her out completely, and with every day that passed, the dread inside her grew. Alex, their 15-year-old son, was confused and increasingly agitated. He would ask the same question nearly every day when he came home from school. "Where's Dad? When is he coming back?" And every day, Sandra gave him the same lie. "He'll be back soon, sweetheart. He's just busy with work." But Alex wasn't stupid. He saw the way his mother's hands shook when she poured his cereal in the morning, the way she paced the living room late at night, glancing at her phone as if it held some kind of answer. "Are you guys fighting?" he asked one evening, his voice small, the fear creeping into his words. Sandra looked at him, her eyes filling with tears she quickly wiped away. "No, Alex, we're not fighting. Everything will be okay, I promise." But even as she said the words, she knew she was lying to herself, too. 2 weeks to the day after Anthony disappeared, he came back. Sandra was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping anxiously on the surface of her phone, when she saw his car pull up through the window. Her heart leapt into her throat. She jumped up so quickly the chair fell back, crashing to the floor. She didn't care. She sprinted to the door, her hands fumbling to unlock it. "Anthony!" she shouted, practically throwing herself outside. She couldn't believe he was there, standing just feet away from her after what felt like an eternity. "Oh my God, you're back. I was so worried But Anthony didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her frantic words or her desperate expression. He walked past her, silent and unflinching, as though she was nothing more than air. His face was unreadable, calm in a way that frightened Sandra more than any outburst ever could. "Anthony?" Sandra's voice was small, trembling. "Anthony, please, talk to me." He stepped into the house without a word, leaving her standing on the porch, stunned and confused. For a moment, she was frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. But then her feet moved, and she rushed after him. Inside, Anthony moved with quiet efficiency. He walked straight to their bedroom, as if he had come with a single, focused purpose. Sandra followed him down the hallway, her heart pounding louder with every step. "Anthony, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice rising in panic as she watched him open their closet and pull out a suitcase. Her eyes widened as he started grabbing his clothes, folding them neatly and placing them into the case. "Anthony, stop!" she cried, rushing toward him, grabbing his arm. "Please stop this. Talk to me. I'm begging you." Anthony pulled his arm away, still not saying a word. His silence was crushing, suffocating. Sandra's breathing quickened, and her hands shook as she reached for him again, only for him to brush past her. "Anthony, please," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened. It was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt you." But Anthony remained focused on his task. He grabbed more clothes, personal items, anything that belonged to him. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if every moment had been planned long before he arrived. Sandra's desperation grew with every second. She grabbed at his hands, his shoulders, trying to make him stop, make him look at her. "Please, Anthony, don't do this. Don't leave us. Alex needs you. I need you." Finally, Anthony spoke, his voice low and steady. "I'm done, Sandra." The words hit her like a slap to the face. She stumbled back, her hands dropping to her sides. "Done? What do you mean, done?" Her voice cracked. "You can't just walk away like this. We've been married for 15 years. We have a son." Anthony zipped up the suitcase and stood, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he walked into the house. His face was expressionless, but there was something cold in his eyes, something final. "I'm done with this marriage," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm done with you." Sandra gasped, her knees threatening to buckle. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Anthony, no, please, you can't just leave. I love you." Anthony's lips tightened for a moment, but he said nothing. He lifted the suitcase and turned to walk out of the room. "Where are you going?" Sandra whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where are you going?" He paused in the doorway, his back to her. "You don't need to know. This is over. But I come back for one important thing." Sandra collapsed onto the bed, her sobs echoing in the empty house as Anthony's footsteps faded down the hall. She heard the front door open and close, and just like that, he was gone again. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Sandra sat on the bed, staring at the wall, her mind numb. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there when she heard the door to Alex's room creak open. "Mom!" His voice was small, unsure. "Is Dad back?" Sandra wiped at her face with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. He was here." Alex stepped into the doorway, frowning. "But where is he now? Why didn't he stay?" Sandra opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She looked at her son, seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes, and it broke her all over again. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. She couldn't tell him that his father had just walked out on them, walked out on their life. "I don't know, baby," she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know." Alex looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his room, closing the door behind him. Sandra sat in the quiet, the weight of Anthony's absence pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if Anthony would ever come back, or if her marriage was truly over. All she knew was that her life would never be the same. Weeks had passed since the anniversary party, 2 weeks since the truth about Sandra's infidelity had exploded into their lives. For Sandra, those days had felt like an eternity, a constant churn of anxiety and dread. She could barely sleep, and when she did, her dreams were filled with images of Anthony walking away from her over and over again. Today, however, was different. Anthony had returned again, as he said. Early that morning, he had come into the house with an unsettling calmness, telling her and Alex to pack their things for a drive. He offered no explanation, no hints as to where they were going. Sandra's hands had trembled as she threw clothes into a suitcase, her mind racing with 100 questions she didn't dare ask. Beside her, Alex had packed silently, his young face twisted in confusion and concern. Now, they sat in the car, Sandra in the front seat, Alex in the back. The silence was thick, oppressive, as the car sped down the road. Anthony's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white, his jaw set. Every now and then, Sandra would glance at him, hoping for a word, a glance, anything. But he remained cold, detached. She knew something terrible was about to happen, but she didn't know what. After what felt like hours, they pulled into a neighborhood Sandra recognized instantly. Her heart sank as they approached a large house at the end of the street, Jose's house. She turned to Anthony, her voice cracking with fear. "Why are we here?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "Anthony, why did you bring us here?" Anthony didn't answer. He pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and stepped out of the car without a word. Sandra sat frozen for a moment, her mind spinning with panic, before she unbuckled her seatbelt and followed him. "Anthony, please, what's going on?" she begged, her voice trembling as she hurried after him. But Anthony was focused, purposeful. He walked to the trunk, opened it, and began pulling out their suitcases, hers, Alex's, and every item that wasn't his. Sandra's heart dropped as she watched him pile their things on the driveway. Alex stepped out of the car, his eyes wide with confusion. "Dad!" Alex's voice was small, uncertain. "Why are we here? What's going on?" Anthony didn't answer his son either. Instead, he picked up the suitcases, walked up to Jose's front door, and knocked loudly. Sandra stood frozen, a sick feeling in her stomach. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She rushed forward, grabbing Anthony's arm. "Anthony, stop. Please, tell me what's happening. Why are you doing this?" Anthony shook her off, his face as cold and distant as ever. "You'll see," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. Moments later, the door opened, and there stood Jose, still groggy, his hair disheveled as if he'd just woken up. When he saw Anthony standing there, holding suitcases, his face twisted with confusion. "Anthony? What the hell's going on?" Jose asked, his voice laced with surprise. His eyes flicked between Anthony and Sandra, and then to Alex, who stood awkwardly by the car, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. Without a word, Anthony threw the bags at Jose's feet. The loud thud of the suitcases hitting the ground echoed through the quiet morning air. Then, with a deliberate, almost chilling calm, Anthony pulled 2 papers from his jacket pocket and thrust them into Jose's hands, divorce papers and a DNA test. Jose blinked, staring down at the documents, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on him. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice rising with alarm as he quickly scanned the papers. Anthony's voice was cold, emotionless. "Here, you guys can live with him now. I'm done with all of it. Done with the lies. Done with the betrayal." He turned to Sandra, his eyes like ice. "I'm washing my hands of you." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sandra's feet. Her breath caught in her throat as the full weight of his words hit her. This wasn't just anger, this wasn't just hurt, this was the end. The finality in his voice was undeniable. "No!" Sandra screamed, rushing toward him, grabbing his arm as if she could physically hold him back from leaving. "Anthony, please don't do this. Don't leave us. Please, I'm begging you." Her voice broke, the sobs racking her body. "It was a mistake, Anthony. It was so long ago, and I love you. I always have. Please." But Anthony didn't even flinch. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her pleas. He shook her off once more, turning his back on her completely. Without another word, he started walking back to the car. "Dad!" Alex's voice, so small and frightened, cut through the chaos. He stepped forward, his eyes wide with confusion. "Where are you going? Why aren't you coming with us?" Anthony paused for a brief moment, his back still turned to his family. Sandra held her breath, praying that he would at least talk to their son, that he would soften, explain, say something. But when Anthony finally spoke, his voice was cold, distant. "I'll see you around, Alex. Take care of yourself." That was it. No explanation, no goodbye. Just those few, empty words. Anthony got into the car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving Sandra, Alex, and Jose standing in stunned silence on the driveway. The sound of the car engine faded into the distance, and the silence that followed was deafening. Sandra stood there, frozen, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Her legs felt like they might give out at any second. She turned to Jose, her face wet with tears, her voice barely a whisper. What have I done?" she choked out, her hands trembling as she hugged herself tightly, as if trying to hold her world together by sheer willpower. Jose, still reeling from the shock, stepped forward awkwardly, glancing at Alex, who stood quietly, his expression blank and uncomprehending. "Sandra, I don't know what to say," Jose stammered, his face pale. "I didn't think," Sandra cut him off, her voice rising in anger. "You didn't think? You didn't think?" she shouted, stepping toward him, her hands balled into fists. "You ruined everything. You destroyed my family. And for what? A stupid mistake on our wedding day? Why did you say anything?" Jose took a step back, his hands raised defensively. "Sandra, I didn't mean for this to happen. I was drunk. It just came out." Sandra let out a bitter laugh, her voice thick with disbelief. "Drunk? Drunk? That's your excuse? You've destroyed my life. Jose, do you even realize what you've done?" Jose opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips. There was nothing he could say, nothing that would undo the damage that had been done. He stood there, helpless, as Sandra collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Alex, who had been silent through it all, walked over to his mother, his young face etched with worry. He crouched down beside her, wrapping his arms around her as she cried. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's going to be okay." But Sandra knew better. Nothing would ever be okay again. She had lost everything. Living with Jose was nothing like Sandra had imagined. When she had once viewed him as an escape, a thrilling distraction from her stable, predictable life with Anthony, he now embodied her worst regrets. The initial excitement that had driven their affair had long since faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt, shame, and emptiness. Days blurred into weeks as Sandra and Alex settled into Jose's house. But settling wasn't the right word. It was more like trying to survive each day, navigating through a new life Sandra never wanted. She had made her choice years ago, and now every second felt like punishment. Jose was hardly ever home during the day, leaving her and Alex alone in the eerily quiet house. When he was around, things weren't much better. His carefree charm had given way to drunken bitterness, and with each passing night, His resentment grew more palpable. One evening, Jose came home late, as usual. The sound of the front door slamming reverberated through the house. Sandra was sitting in the dimly lit living room, pretending to read, though her eyes hadn't scanned the pages in hours. She heard the heavy thud of his boots on the floor as he staggered toward the kitchen. The clinking of bottles echoed down the hall, and she knew what was coming. A few minutes later, Jose stumbled into the room, bottle in hand, his eyes bloodshot. "You just sit there all day now, huh?" he slurred, collapsing onto the couch opposite her. "This isn't what I signed up for." Sandra didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the book, trying to ignore him, trying not to engage. But he wasn't going to let her. "You think this is what I wanted?" he spat, the words dripping with contempt. "You think I wanted to play house with you and that kid?" At that, Sandra flinched. Alex had gone to bed hours earlier, but the mention of her son sent a wave of protectiveness through her. She set the book down and looked at Jose, her voice shaking. "He's your son too, Jose. You can't just... Mine?" Jose cut her off with a harsh laugh. "I didn't even think he was mine. And let's be real, Sandra, you weren't exactly loyal, were you? How do I know you weren't sleeping with half the damn guest list that day?" The accusation hit her like a punch to the gut. Sandra's eyes welled up with tears, but she swallowed them down. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You know that's not true," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "But you don't care, do you?" Jose scoffed, taking another swig from his bottle. "Care? Why would I? I didn't ask for this." He leaned back, his head rolling against the back of the couch. "You think I wanted to be tied down with your kid? I never wanted this." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sandra stared at him. The man she had once thought she wanted, now so foreign, so cruel. She had given up everything for him. And for what? For a man who couldn't care less about her or her son. For a life that felt more like a prison sentence than a fresh start. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sandra stood up slowly, her movements stiff. "I'm going to bed," she muttered, walking out of the room before Jose could say anything else. She climbed the stairs to the bedroom she shared with Alex now. Every night, she lay next to him, his presence the only comfort in her world. But even though it was fading as Alex grew more distant, more confused, and increasingly hurt by everything that had happened. While Sandra's life spiraled downward, Anthony's took an unexpected turn upward. Moving into his own apartment had felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild without the weight of betrayal hanging over him. The first few days had been difficult. He missed Alex terribly, and the loneliness of the quiet apartment gnawed at him. But gradually, the solitude became peaceful. He no longer had to deal with the pain of seeing Sandra every day or the constant reminder of what she had done. At work, Anthony's focus sharpened. He threw himself into his career with a new sense of purpose, staying late at the office, taking on new projects, and climbing the ladder faster than he had expected. Colleagues noticed the change in him. He was more driven, more determined, and strangely at ease. His boss had even remarked, "You seem like a different man these days, Anthony. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." And that was the thing, Anthony was a different man now. He had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. The betrayal had cut deep, but it no longer defined him. He wasn't the husband of the cheating wife, the fool who didn't see it coming. He was free. In his new life, Anthony found happiness in the small things. Early morning runs through the park, where he could clear his mind and watch the sunrise. The simple pleasure of cooking dinner for himself, without the tension of strained conversation hanging over the table. And most of all, reconnecting with Alex on weekends when they would go to baseball games or just hang out at the apartment playing video games. The bond between father and son was stronger than ever now. Anthony made sure of that. One Saturday afternoon, after a particularly fun day at the park, Alex turned to Anthony with a question that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. "Dad, why can't I live with you all the time?" Alex asked, his eyes searching Anthony's face for answers. "I don't like it at Jose's uncle's house. It's weird. I just want to stay here." Anthony's heart ached at his son's words. He had been trying so hard to shield Alex from the worst of it, but there was no escaping the fact that his son was suffering too. He knelt down to meet Alex's gaze. I know, buddy. I know it's hard, but it's only for a little while. We're figuring things out, okay? You'll always have a place here with me. Alex nodded, though the sadness in his eyes remained. He hugged his father tightly, and Anthony held him close, wishing he could take away all of the pain. Back at Jose's house, things continued to deteriorate. Sandra found herself trapped in a life she couldn't escape. Every day was the same. Jose's drinking, his biting comments, the suffocating weight of her regret. She tried to make things better for Alex, but even he was slipping away from her. He spent more and more time locked in his room, avoiding both Jose and his mother. One night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Sandra couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. She had made her choice, thinking it would lead to excitement, to something more than the life she had with Anthony. But she had been so wrong. Now, she had nothing, no love, no respect, and no future. Just a hollow shell of the life she had destroyed. The fallout of her decisions was everywhere she looked, and there was no escaping it. Months had passed since Sandra's world had come crashing down. Living with Jose had become a nightmare. His drinking escalated, turning him from bitter to cruel. Each night was worse than the last, with slurred accusations, broken bottles, and venomous arguments. The spark that had once ignited their affair had long since been extinguished, leaving behind only resentment and regret. Jose didn't care about her, didn't care about Alex, and seemed to barely care about himself anymore. He had turned into a ghost of the man Sandra once thought she loved. One evening, after another violent argument where Jose had stormed out in a drunken rage, Sandra sat on the floor of the darkened living room, trembling. The bruises on her soul weighed heavier than anything Jose could do to her physically. She couldn't take it anymore, the suffocating regret, the endless reminders of what she had thrown away. She thought about Alex, who had become even more withdrawn, refusing to talk to her and spending as much time as possible with Anthony on weekends. Her son had every right to hate her, and that realization crushed her more than anything. That night, Sandra made a decision. She needed to face the person she had hurt the most. She needed to see Anthony. With shaking hands, Sandra grabbed her coat, slipped out the door, and drove to Anthony's apartment. She had seen it before, dropping Alex off on weekends, but she had never actually gone inside. Every time she watched her son walk through those doors, a pang of loss stabbed through her. But she never had the courage to follow him. Until tonight. The car ride felt like an eternity, each mile closer intensifying her dread. Sandra's thoughts raced as she tried to figure out what she would say, how she could possibly explain herself. How do you ask for forgiveness for destroying someone's life? How do you apologize for something as monumental as betrayal? When she finally arrived, she sat in her car for several minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The apartment building loomed in front of her, a physical representation of the life Anthony had rebuilt without her. Her pulse raced as she stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her face as she walked up the steps. With each step, her resolve wavered. What if he wouldn't listen? What if he slammed the door in her face? She wouldn't blame him if he did, but she had to try. At the door, Sandra hesitated, her hand trembling as it hovered over the knocker. She took a deep breath and knocked softly, her heart thudding in her chest. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. Moments later, the door opened. Anthony stood in front of her, looking almost unrecognizable. He seemed stronger, more assured. There was no trace of the broken man she had left behind. He stared at her, his face unreadable, but his eyes held none of the warmth she had once taken for granted. "Anthony," Sandra began, her voice barely above a whisper. She fought to keep herself from breaking down right there. I need to talk to you." Anthony leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't invite her in. He didn't even move. His gaze bore into her, waiting for her to speak, but offering nothing in return. Sandra swallowed hard. "Please, can we talk?" Her voice cracked as the floodgates opened. "I made a terrible mistake, Anthony. I know that now. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I don't even know where to begin." Anthony's expression didn't change. "What do you want, Sandra?" he asked, his tone calm but icy. "It's been months. Why are you here now? She flinched at his words, but she forced herself to keep going. I can't do this without you, she said, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. I can't live like this anymore. Jose, he's not who I thought he was. He never cared about me. He never cared about Alex. I was so stupid. I was selfish. But I know that now. Please, Anthony, for the sake of everything we had, for the sake of our son, can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? Anthony stared at her, unmoved by her desperation. Forgive you, he repeated, his voice carrying a weight that felt like a slap in the face. You think this is about forgiveness, Sandra? You think you can come here, months later, and apologize, and that everything will magically go back to the way it was? I know it's not that simple, Sandra sobbed. But I'm begging you, Anthony. I love you. I always loved you. I made a terrible mistake. I don't want this life without you in it. Anthony shook his head slowly, the coldness in his eyes intensifying. You made your choice, Sandra. You chose Jose. You chose to betray me, betray our family, on our wedding day of all days. I gave you everything, my trust, my love, and you threw it all away. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed our family. You destroyed Alex's world. Sandra's knees felt weak. Please, she whispered, barely able to get the word out. Please, Anthony, don't leave me like this. Anthony's face hardened. I'm not leaving you. You already left me. You left me the moment you chose Jose. And I'm done. I've moved on. You need to move on, too. The finality in his words hit Sandra like a punch to the gut. She staggered backward, the reality sinking in. There was no saving this. There was no going back. Anthony had truly moved on. Anthony straightened, pushing away from the doorframe. I'm here for Alex, but that's it. As far as we're concerned, there's nothing left to fix. Sandra stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. And with that, Anthony took one last look at her, then closed the door firmly, leaving her standing in the hallway, alone with the consequences of her choices. She sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her heart breaking all over again. But this time, it wasn't because of the betrayal or the lies. It was because she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had lost him forever. Years passed after the disastrous events that had unraveled Anthony's life. With each passing day, Anthony found himself further away from the pain and closer to a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The chaos that had once dominated his world, the betrayal, the heartache, the anger, had faded into distant memories, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose and freedom. Anthony had taken time to heal, diving deep into the things that had always brought him joy but had long been neglected. He picked up hiking again, something he hadn't done in years, finding solace in nature's vastness. He reconnected with old friends, traveled to places he had always dreamed of, and, more importantly, built a solid foundation with his son, Alex. Alex had been the bright spot in the entire ordeal. Although the split between Anthony and Sandra had been hard on him, he had come out of it more mature, understanding more about the complexities of life than most kids his age. He spent his time between both parents, but had naturally grown closer to his father. Anthony became the stable rock in Alex's life, someone he could rely on when everything else felt uncertain. The two bonded over shared activities, weekend camping trips, basketball games, and late-night talks that brought them closer than ever. One day, after a particularly rewarding hike, Anthony sat with Alex on a high cliff overlooking the valley below. The breeze was cool, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. "Dad," Alex began, kicking at a rock near his feet. "Do you ever think about what happened? You know, with Mom and Jose?" Anthony glanced over at his son, now nearly a teenager, and nodded. "Yeah, I do sometimes. It's hard not to." Alex looked down, his expression thoughtful. "Does it still hurt?" Anthony sighed, taking in the peaceful scenery around them. "It used to. A lot. But I've learned to let it go. Some things aren't worth holding on to, Alex. Your mom made her choices, and I had to make mine." Alex seemed to chew on that for a moment before asking, "Do you think you'll ever forgive her?" Anthony smiled, though there was sadness in it. "I think, in a way, I already have. Not for her sake, But for mine, holding on to that anger only keeps you stuck. I had to move on if I wanted to be happy again. And I am, happier than I've been in a long time. The conversation lingered in the air as they sat in comfortable silence, both content in their bond, knowing that whatever had happened, they still had each other. Meanwhile, Sandra's life took a very different trajectory. After Jose had left her, unable to bear the weight of the guilt and the mess they had created, Sandra found herself utterly alone. Jose's departure had been swift and brutal. One day, he packed his things, muttered something about how he never signed up for this, and walked out the door without looking back. He left her with nothing but the wreckage of their brief and ill-fated relationship. In the wake of his departure, Sandra spiraled into a pit of regret. Her once steady life had crumbled into a series of painful days filled with self-recrimination. The guilt gnawed at her, keeping her up at night and making her every waking moment a reminder of the life she had destroyed. She had thrown away 15 years of marriage for a fleeting affair with a man who couldn't even look at her without resentment. And now, she had no one. Sandra tried to rebuild her life, but the damage had been done. Alex, who spent less and less time with her, had grown distant. Though he visited her out of obligation, their relationship never recovered. The walls that had gone up between them were impenetrable, and no amount of apologies could tear them down. Alex was polite but cold. She could see it in his eyes. He blamed her for everything, and she couldn't argue with that. One cold winter evening, Sandra sat alone in her small, cluttered apartment, staring out the window as snow began to fall. The TV was on in the background, but she wasn't watching. She thought about the life she had had with Anthony, the stability, the love, the family, and how she had let it all slip away. The regrets came in waves, drowning her as she sat with the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. She picked up her phone and stared at the screen, her finger hovering over Anthony's contact. She hadn't tried to reach out to him in months, not after he had made it clear that there was no room for reconciliation. But tonight, something in her ached for connection, for some semblance of the life she had lost. Before she could convince herself otherwise, she typed out a message. I'm so sorry, Anthony. I miss you. I miss Alex. I wish I could take it all back. Her finger hovered over the send button, but in the end, she couldn't do it. She deleted the message and put the phone down, realizing that no apology would ever be enough. She had to live with what she had done, and the pain of that reality was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Anthony, on the other hand, was thriving. He eventually met someone new, a woman named Rachel who shared his love of adventure and laughter. Their relationship was easy, free of the complications and betrayals that had marred his past. Rachel respected his boundaries, and they built something solid, something real. She was kind to Alex, and over time, the three of them formed a new kind of family, one built on trust and mutual respect. Years later, Anthony would reflect on his journey, how he had risen from the ashes of betrayal and rebuilt a life filled with love and joy. He had found peace, not because he had forgotten the past, but because he had learned from it. His happiness wasn't dependent on erasing the pain, but on creating a future where it no longer controlled him. As for Sandra, she continued to live with the consequences of her actions. Each day was a reminder of the life she had ruined and the love she had lost. And though she tried to move forward, the shadow of her mistakes loomed large over her, ensuring that happiness would remain just out of reach. In the end, Anthony lived happily, free from the chains of betrayal, while Sandra and Jose were left to suffer the consequences of their choices.